Okay, I think we will get started. So I want to introduce, first I want to say thank everyone for coming this evening for AAO-HNS National Medical Student Forum. My name is Erin Fawcett, and I want to welcome you to our program, Diverse Journeys to Otolaryngology. So this is a quick agenda of what we'll be discussing tonight. Toward the end of the hour, we will have some time for questions and answers. So please feel free to add them to the chat box and we will address and get to as many as we can. Before we start, I do want to give a huge shout out to not only our panelists, but our entire group of contributors, including two all-star medical students for making this program possible. And so I just really want to acknowledge each of these individuals. And this is a quick, just a repeat slide from a previous program, but we wanted to remind you of all the great things that the AAO has to offer. And as you can see, there are so many medical students that are interested in our specialty, and we're excited about that and excited to recruit even more. I also want to add that this year, the AAO is celebrating its 125th anniversary as a specialty. So the AAO started a 125 Strong campaign, which is an effort designed and driven by practicing otolaryngologists all over the world. And the AAO has decided to focus on these particular efforts that you can see on the bottom of the screen. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion, education, leadership development and mentorship, and wellness. And as you can see here, our objectives tonight are as follows. We want to help you guys successfully navigate the system to map into otolaryngology head and neck surgery, provide tools and resources for underrepresented in medicine students and students with the not so traditional path. And lastly, we want to discuss challenges and personal experiences by our panelists. So before I introduce our panelists, a little bit about myself. I'll be moderating tonight. I'm a pediatric otolaryngologist at Phoenix Children's Hospital and assistant professor of otolaryngology at both Mayo Clinic in Arizona and University of Arizona in Phoenix. I'm also the current chair of the AAO Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and all of our panelists tonight serve as members of this committee. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee is sponsoring this program tonight, and so again, we're super excited to have you all. First, we have Dr. Wumpa, who is a postdoctoral research fellow and resident at the Department of Otolaryngology-Head and Neck Surgery, Washington University in St. Louis. We have Dr. Bo, who is Associate Professor of Surgery of Uniformed Services University, as well as Deputy Chair of Surgery at San Antonio Military Health System. We have Dr. Brown, who is Associate Vice President and Associate Dean for Health, Equity, and Inclusion, and Associate Professor of Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, and Pediatric Otolaryngologist at University of Michigan Medical School. And lastly, Dr. Taylor, who is a professor and chair of the Otolaryngology Department at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And so from there, I will stop sharing my screen and I will ask Dr. Wumpa to share hers. We can get started.
Basically just saying thanks for having me. And my talk is mostly going to be focused on kind of the application process and then early parts of residency. So just kind of brief about me. I'm from Kansas City and I'm in residency at WashU in St. Louis. I'm a clinical fourth-year resident, but I also participated in the research track, which is a 7-year-long program. And some various different departments kind of offer this track, and I'm happy to talk about that too later this evening. But I'm completing my second year of that. So these, when I think back to when I was a medical student in my second and third year of medical school, when I was first learning about ENT, These three things really stood out to me as the main keys for developing my plan to apply into otolaryngology. I came from a medical school that didn't have its own department. And so you have to kind of be a little bit more strategic than most when you're trying to plan and map out how you're going to make yourself noticed. So the first part required a lot of self-reflection. You kind of have to look at your application as a whole and what you could potentially bring to different programs. But then you also kind of have to look at other things like your interest level, work ethic, things like that, that not really on paper. And you have to really be thoughtful about how you can demonstrate that to someone meeting you for the first time and really wanting to understand why you want to do otolaryngology. At the same time, you also have to be your own advocate and look carefully at programs and ask yourself, what can a program also do for you? And so I'll talk a little bit about that some more as I go along. The second thing is to get involved. Like I said, it was a little bit challenging coming from a program that didn't have an otolaryngology department. So I quickly learned about a local program about 15 minutes away at the University of Kansas. And so I was kind of a regular there at their conferences or educational meetings. And I really, really got involved shadowing and kind of just making myself known, making my presence known to them. And so it was almost as if I was one of their own medical students. And then lastly, you really want to identify mentors. And we'll obviously talk about this later tonight. Your mentor doesn't necessarily have to look exactly like you, but it has to be someone with your best interests at heart and who's willing to go to bat for you. And I did happen to find someone like that at the University of Kansas. As we'll talk about a little bit later, we all have had encounters that were a little bit difficult. There were certain times where, especially coming from my medical school, people kind of questioned my ability to be able to do otolaryngology and match, because you're kind of coming out of nowhere and it's a very small field. But once you identify that mentor and keep in close contact with them, they kind of introduce you to other people, which is what this figure kind of represents. As you realize more and more, otolaryngology is a pretty small world, and one person knows someone who knows somebody else. And so it's always helpful to establish those good relationships and kind of get your name out there. And the most important thing you can do for yourself is to keep in touch with your mentor. After you've matched and you've kind of found your success, you still want to keep a good relationship with them because other opportunities could come down the line. So when I think about the road to residency, there's 5 key steps that I really focused on back when I was a student. And the first is your rotations and your performance. So obviously you have your core rotations in medicine and surgery, and you do want to perform well on those and put a lot of effort in those, because otolaryngology is challenging. It is a blend of medicine and surgery, which is why I love it. And so you want to be able to put yourself in a position where you can be knowledgeable about a lot of different things and kind of show your work ethic through your rotations. Next is the personal statement. As someone who loves to write, this is probably one of my favorite parts of the application process, believe it or not. It's not something that everybody looks forward to doing, but I actually really enjoyed it. But you can't have enough people look at it for you. And so you have to have your mentors look at it, people from your medical school that may not be an ENT, but you also kind of look to for mentorship. And then I also had people at our writing studio. I think most institutions have some form of that is able to look at drafts of paperwork for you. And so a stranger is looking at it, and they should be able to tell you about you after reading your personal statement, even if they don't know what otolaryngology is, as well as look for small things like typos and things like that. Next is the letter of recommendation. You always want to be pretty strategic about that. Most of mine came from my away rotations, just because, again, I was in the situation I was in. But you want to be able to have good letters about people that are able to write strong, positive things about you. Interview day, it's always nerve-wracking. I know this year was particularly different because of Zoom. I've not encountered a Zoom interview, but I've talked to several of recently matched medical students, and it's a totally different ball game, but the same fundamental basics are there. You know, you want to show up. Your first impression is your best impression. And so you want to be engaged. You want to have a list of questions that you ask. So before every interview, you want to do a good job trying to research the program and develop questions that you can ask back to them. Because like I said earlier, you're also wanting to know what the program can do for you. As a Black female, it was really important to me to see kind of the lay of the land in the program as far as kind of what members constituted the department. And so it was always kind of interesting to me if someone didn't have a photo roster. I mean, it's something small, but it's something that I looked for because it's just nice to know that you could have a potential support system wherever you end up. And so that was something that was important to me. And then other things like research interests and things like that, which I can talk more specifically about if people have questions. But you really want to do your homework about the program because they're pretty much doing the same thing about you, reading your personal statement and things like that. And then finally, match day. It's such an exciting day. It's one of the most exciting days I've ever experienced. You find out where you're going. But it's also a humbling day where you should look back and thank the people that helped you, your mentors that helped you. Send them a text saying, hey, this is where I ended up. Thank you so much for all of your support. Because they actually do expect you to text them. And if you don't, it is a little bit of you wouldn't think that, but, and you can get kind of busy and tied up with your day, but you don't want to forget to thank the people that helped you get to where you are. And then I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about early residency. So I mentioned that I'm in the research track at WashU. So I've completed the first 2 years of my clinical residency, and I'm about to finish 2 years of research before I go back as a mid-level resident at PGY 3. And so these are kind of 3 pearls that I've kind of learned from seniors talking to me and advising me, and then my own experiences as a resident. First is that the best ability is availability. You really want to be there. Sometimes it can be challenging with residency and life things get in the way. But the first bullet point really just kind of addresses timeliness, showing up early, staying late, offering to help. People really do appreciate when you go out of your way to do that and show that kind of engagement. The second is to be an essential team member. You want to be so helpful that if something were to happen or if you go on vacation and you're gone, the team really notices your absence. And so that kind of just goes along with the first point, being helpful, being available, being willing to do some of the things that people may not love doing, but you know kind of helps move patient care along. And then finally, the last is to prioritize your learning. As a first-year resident especially, and even as a second-year consult resident, it can be pretty overwhelming, some of the clinical tasks that kind of get in your way, but you do not want to forget that you're also there to learn. And so you want to put yourself in positions where you can be successful in the OR by reading and kind of staying on top of the knowledge aspect of things, asking questions, because at the end of 5 years, you know, you want to be able to say what you learned and feel like you learned everything that you can to be a successful otolaryngologist, rather than kind of work, and you look up and residency's over. So don't forget to take out time to prioritize your learning. That is all I have. I think we are going on to the next speaker, correct?
Yep, so thank you so much. That was awesome. We will have Dr. Bo now.
All right. Hello, I'm Dr. Sarah Bo. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of the background of where we are as a specialty in otolaryngology, and give some resources towards the end for ways that we can try to support you in the process. And so, I think Dr. Wumpuk kind of touched on this, but it's very much navigating a system, and sometimes it can seem like you can see the end, but it's quite the maze for you to get there. So hopefully we can give you guys some resources by the end. And so I think sometimes it's important to start with definitions. And a fairly well-known definition is that of the AAMC. And when we're talking about underrepresented in medicine, more specifically, it often draws back to racial and ethnic populations that are underrepresented relative to their numbers in the general population. And this definition kind of moved away from really fixed groups, and also started to kind of allow some opportunities to think maybe not just from a national perspective, but how that relates also from a regional and a local perspective as well. And so looking to otolaryngology, a recent paper talked about the long race to diversity. And so looking at 2018 data across internal medicine, general surgery, and ENT, you can see clearly the definition of underrepresented is that in med school enrollment, that those groups are less than the US Census population. But you can also see that that trend tends to be sustained throughout the medical education continuum. And so when we think about this, there's many reasons for this, and some of them have been touched on, certainly from a lack of role model standpoint, then that can impact the diversity of the applicant pool. There can be less engagement in the pipeline for those reasons. And then working to get through the selection process and further on along the continuum can really be impacted when individuals aren't supported throughout. And then there's weaker networks and kind of less mentoring and sponsorship that might happen throughout. And so all of these pieces can impact workforce diversity. And so again, kind of looking a little bit more in detail at the Black population within this study in ENT, you can see kind of across the continuum, we have diminishing representation throughout the pipeline, such that even back in 2010, there were no ENT professors that were Black. And so I think it's important for us to, be transparent about this. And really, it does kind of come back to some of that reflection piece. And so recently this year, one of the applying medical students wrote a perspective that was published in ENT Today, really urging the community to think about diversity and inclusion in otolaryngology residency. And so she touched on not just kind of her individual identities, but also aspects of intersectionality that can really be impactful, not just kind of her being Black, but also being a woman and also being from perhaps a medical school that it's not as well known or well resourced. And kind of moving on, certainly when we look at other applicant types, we know that allopathic senior medical students tend to do better in terms of getting interview invites as well as ranking. And so certainly I know that there's many of you out there that might be from osteopathic programs or foreign medical graduate programs. And certainly, this is another recognized group that we want to be able to support more, recognizing some of these past trends within our specialty. And again, similarly, there have been commentaries and perspectives saying, we need to think about this outreach for bringing these type of applicants in through our specialty and supporting them. And so I think that this kind of relates very well to efforts that are being pushed more broadly to really enhance the workforce, and very much so starts with setting diversity as a priority. And this ties back into what Dr. Fawcett spoke about at the beginning in terms of the Academy's 125th anniversary and really a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And so there's certainly many components that go into the process, but really recognizing and placing intentionality on diversity efforts is the starting point that we need to have and move forward from. And this, again, has been kind of presented within our community more recently. A group looked at the prevalence of diversity and inclusion language on program websites as well as the presence of diversity inclusion initiatives at either the department or the institutional level, and looked at that in comparison to the gender diversity of the faculty and trainees at that program. And while certainly institutional, so kind of broader, larger hospital-based diversity and inclusion initiatives were highly prevalent, 100%. Program-specific diversity and inclusion initiatives were only found on 20% of ENT websites. And so there's certainly some deviation in what is out there in terms of the different programs. And when this group looked at the mentioning of diversity programs or specifics in regards to initiatives, there was a statistically significant difference, as well as, if you look at it, kind of a clinically or practically significant difference, where the gender proportion in terms of females in those programs was 6 to 7% higher. And so almost closer to parity numbers, as opposed to programs that didn't identify that priority. So again, that's potentially indicating some of that setting diversity as a priority. And so I'm going to kind of transition from that background piece to some resources. And I've tried to put kind of some of the information down in terms of websites and everything at the bottom. And I'm going to scroll through a number of resources somewhat quickly here. So the Head Mirror website, which some of you may have heard about, but it is a kind of group of individuals from all around the country from many different programs. We have a number of medical student pages, and we do have a specific focus page on diversity and inclusion. And really the intent behind that is to try to pull together some of these resources from many other organizations. And so I will flip through those, but certainly the Society of University Otolaryngologists, there's linked to the Harry Barnes Society, as well as Academy resources. And so really trying to make it easy to find these resources. And so in terms of, for instance, the Society of University Otolaryngologists, there are a number of diversity liaisons at a wide variety of programs. And so as Dr. Wampa mentioned, especially if you have a no-home ENT program, then these are individuals that have already identified the fact that they want to mentor, they want to help. And so they're open and inviting for some of those initial conversations. In terms of medical student resources from the Academy, for instance, there's the Diversity Endowment URMOA Rotation Grant. And so again, these are intentional ways that we're trying to expand the representation within otolaryngology. The National Otolaryngology Interest Group, I will mention here, and in many ways it's actually just starting, but the intent behind this group is to really help particularly the broader group of individuals that are maybe coming from no home ENT programs. And so really trying to foster and connect across interest groups and across residency programs so that we can link up and have a broader mentorship network for individuals. So there will be more to come on this. I am putting this in there as not specifically a direct representative of this group, but we've been supporting them from the Head Mirror and supporting some of their efforts. So there will be a standalone group that's forming. So more to come on that. And then finally, again, in terms of really getting a lot of voices and perspectives and information, there are a series of podcasts that are coming out in a residency application toolkit from Head Mirror. We just had a matched applicant panel as well as a reapplicant panel, and there will be a DO panel and an IMG panel. And so these are voices of kind of recent applicants and basically sharing some of their stories. So kind of similar to what's happening here today, more voices to get some of that experience. I will flip over to the references to leave there for a moment, so it's there for the recording. And then I will stop share.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bo, for all of those resources and that information. And I'm sure that we'll be able to share that again to the larger group. Okay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brown now. You're on mute, Dr. Brown.
Sorry, it's hard to unmute once you screen share. Sorry about that. I'm David Brown, as was mentioned, and I was thanking you for allowing me to share my journey. We all have different journeys, and it's important that we remember that there's not just one path to otolaryngology, and our specialty is looking for diverse individuals, perspectives, and life experiences, and talents, because these will help us serve our patients and our society. So I want to take it back to the very beginning about me. So I'm a biracial, half Black, half Italian, first generation, first in my family to go to college, low socioeconomic status, who grew up in the inner city outside of Newark. 5 of us lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. And the reason why I mention this is to show that even non-traditional or non-privileged people can become otolaryngologists. Fortunately, I was very curious and liked to learn, and was part of the Gifted and Talented program when I was in elementary school. And I decided to become a doctor in the 4th grade when they brought in these cow's hearts and cow's brains. And initially, I wanted to be a veterinarian, but then I realized I wanted to be a pupil doctor. Unfortunately, medicine was a black box to me. I didn't know any doctors, and nonetheless, Black doctors or doctors of color. So I had no idea what the path to medicine was. Since I did well in school, I was accepted to a great college prep high school program through the Better Chance program. And here I learned how to be a competitive student, but I still didn't know much about medicine itself. So I wound up going to Brown for college, where we fortunately have a Black and Latino pre-med society that I was a member. And there's an annual program that brought back Black and Latino alums who were doctors. This is the first time I've ever seen a doctor of color, which is kind of crazy because, I think I was 18 or 19 at that time. And some common themes in other talks that have already been given already today. And that is mentorship. I received mentorship from many of these alums, and those mentorship relationships I continue to today. I was fortunate to be mentored by Dr. Cedric Bright, who became the president of the National Medical Association, and I still maintain this relationship today. I wound up going to medical school at Harvard, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do at that time. And I know there was a question about when did you decide that you wanted to be an otolaryngologist? Since I was a classical instrumentalist, I like working with my hands. And so I thought, maybe I'll be orthopedic surgeon or hand surgeon. And I also like working with kids. And so I tried to merge those. And so I tried hand surgery, pediatric hand surgery, and it just wasn't for me. And so, the process for me was about looking at things that interest me, things that would keep my interest, and things that I can make a difference. So for me, it wasn't until my 3rd year that I kind of learned more about otolaryngology, and I was fascinated by the diversity of cases and how we could help people in various ways, from hearing loss to head and neck tumors. Since I knew I wanted to do pediatric otolaryngology, even at that time, I decided to do a rotation with Dr. Healy, who's pictured here with me. He was the chief of pediatric otolaryngology at Boston Children's at that time. He was a very powerful man and intimidating to many. So prior to the rotation, I was very, very intentional. I actually called his administrative assistant and found out what month he would be most there, because as a busy person, sometimes the chairs and the big leaders are gone for a lot of meetings. And so she said he's around June, but not July. So I said, I'll do the rotation in June. And so I learned that he had a book that he wrote, and I went to the library. I read it 3 times before the rotation. His secretary also allowed me to look at his patient charts the night before, and I prepared and drew things and knew my differentials before going in. It was really important that, I was intentional in impressing him with my interest and knowledge. He was very different than me, and this was mentioned as well. He was white, he was well off, he had a different political beliefs than me, but he was still an amazing mentor to me. Someone mentioned about research as well. So I also did a year of research in medical school between my 3rd and 4th year after I knew I wanted to be an otolaryngologist, and I worked in the Boston Children's Otolaryngology Lab. At that time, I got to know Dr. Healy even more because I attended the clinical conferences and national meetings with him. So if you do research, make sure that you also participate in networking. So you, as you are producing great research, you are also getting people to know you. When I was applying for residency, I wanted interviews at, what I considered my most desirable programs. And I got, there were 3 of them, and I got interviews at 2, but not the 3rd, which happened to be Michigan. So Dr. Healy was out of the country. So I went to my other mentor and I said, hey, can you help me get an interview at Michigan because I'm on the waiting list with them? And he told me, you have great interviews, don't worry about Michigan. So I began to stop even considering it as an option. Fortunately, when Dr. Healy returned, he asked me to bring a list of the programs that I did and did not get interviews. He asked me to pick 2. I picked Michigan. He picked another one. He told me to go home. I remember, and he said that people will call me very soon. Sure enough, within 2 hours, I got a call from Michigan. They said that morning they put a letter in the mail, at that time snail mail, denying me an interview. They told me to please disregard that because they have an interview for me next Thursday. I ultimately wound up matching at Michigan, and now I have my diploma as well as my rejection letter. So a few learning lessons for me that Dr. Healy was not only my mentor, but my sponsor, and I continue to maintain relationships with him. And another lesson is to never give up on your dreams. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my... I've lost your, hold on, my screen went haywire. Resume share. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Then I became an otolaryngology resident at Michigan. And it was an amazing experience. We had so many Black trainees. In fact, one of them is missing here, and one of them is on the panel tonight, Dr. Rodney Taylor. And this not only provided me mentorship and a sense of belonging, but it also helped me decrease my imposter syndrome and help me thrive. And so it was such an empowering experience to have so many trainees of color at Michigan. While I was there, I did research, and a lot of times this is expected. My research was in genetic hearing loss, and I had a great mentor, Marcy Lesbrunz, who's the senior author on this paper. And after I finished my residency and fellowship, my first academic job, I continued to do genetic hearing loss research. But ultimately, I realized it wasn't my passion, so I reached back to my mentors, Drs. Healy and Lesbrunz, and I felt bad that I wasn't following the traditional path to academic otolaryngology. I was worried that they would think less of me, but the opposite was true. They both said that my clinical work and other experiences could serve as my scholarly contributions. And after that, I began doing more research in resident education, clinical outcomes for pediatric otolaryngology patients. And so you don't need to follow the traditional pathways that other people follow to be successful. 8 years after graduating from residency, I returned to Michigan as a faculty member, and Dr. Lesbrunz remained my mentor. And she knew that I was interested in leadership aspirations. In fact, even the 8 years that I was gone from Michigan, at each academy meeting, we had lunch. And in fact, since I was a faculty member at that time, I could afford to pay for her lunch. But it was really important that I kind of get back and maintain that relationship. So since she knew I was interested in leadership positions, she made sure I got leadership development, training, and experiences throughout the academic medical center. Ultimately, I was able to rise and be named the Associate Dean and Associate Vice President for Health Equity and Inclusion at Michigan Medicine, a position that I have the honor of serving for 5 years. As I think back to my medical school days, this was something that I always wanted to do and had conversations with my diversity dean, Dr. Alvin Poussin, about this. So in closing, my journey is about seeking out mentors, maintaining those relationships, letting them know your goals and aspirations, and having them help you navigate the system to achieve your dreams. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brown. And I do just want to re-emphasize the importance of not only mentorship, but finding your sponsor or sponsors, because there is a difference. And as Dr. Brown mentioned, it can change your whole trajectory. So thanks for sharing. Dr. Taylor, I'd like to share your slide. Oh, actually, I have your slides.
So good evening, and Erin, thank you very much. One way to avoid technical difficulties is to have the moderator put up your slides. So Erin, thank you very much for that. And it really is an honor to join this august panel and have an opportunity to perhaps begin a conversation with our future otolaryngologists. And I'm really going to try to be a little bit more efficient than I intended to, because so many of the principles that Dr. Wampop talked about and Dr. Brown spoke about are really shared. And so I'll try to have some examples too. But my background is a little bit like Dr. Brown's in that it wasn't traditional. I grew up in inner city Philadelphia, where everyone in my sphere looked exactly like me, from my neighborhood to my church to my school. The consistency was a lack of diversity, but it was a very healthy and positive experience. And I think one of the things that I experienced in my early educational journey was that because my teachers looked like me, my peers looked like me, I developed an academic confidence that was really focused and nurtured by my teachers and my early mentors. My parents, they were high school graduates, and like Dr. Brown, I was the first to graduate from college in my family. But in high school, I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to a school that was a preparatory school, where for the very first time I was meeting people who were very different from me culturally, politically, experientially. And one of the themes that Dr. Wampop said that I agree is, be very diverse in being and your mentors. If your mentors don't look like you in terms of age or background, but they're willing to be a mentor, embrace it. And my early exposures, even into medicine, were by generosity from people who cared enough to, help me pursue my curiosity. I had a chance to visit the operating room from one of my peers' fathers, and that was my first and early exposure into medicine. And it was a kernel that would just be watered later and later. And so, but some of my early influences were around the people I looked up to, mentors, the people who fortified my character. In addition to my family and my friends, were coaches. And one of the things that I thought was important is that some of my extracurricular activities that I was able to draw success and help to build confidence into my academics, and they played back and forth. And so one of the things I would say is follow your passions. Make sure that you have balance in your life in addition to education. You heard Dr. Brown talk about being interested in classical instruments and so forth, a passion that he continues to pursue today. And those things not only give you balance, but it allows you to derive confidence that can spill over into your other pursuits. I then left high school and I went to college at Harvard, and I continued to play football. I was involved in extracurriculars in terms of undergraduate government, but importantly, a great mentor of mine, Alan Counter, who served as a mentor until he passed, held the Harvard College Foundation for Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. And it was some of those early exposures. I met national leaders who helped me to shape how I viewed the world, my place in it, and the things that would become and continue to be passionate for me. And so college was an experience where I developed mentors from academics and from athletics and so forth. And I took the leap to go to medical school. And at medical school, I went to Harvard Medical School. And I should say that every step along my educational journey, there was a little bit of a period where I needed to learn that that was the right and appropriate place for me. It was times where there was natural doubt and natural questions. But what was really important also, and is to be able to have other peers, peer mentors. And Erin, if you could go to the next slide. And so one of the things I learned when I was in college, in part because I didn't have family members who were in medicine, I didn't have direct access. There's just lots of things that you don't know. And developing mentorship, you heard Dr. Brown, go a step beyond and really, whether it's contacting the administrative assistant of someone, but you need to learn to ask questions. And the fact that you guys are here on this call right now, you're already beginning to do that. But just fundamental things. When I entered medical school, I didn't know that there was a calendar, if you will, of what courses you should take at what year so that you can apply and not miss time. And so these were things that I had to kind of learn a little bit and play catch up on, and even take summer classes after my first year. And I really learned to try to be as engaged with upper class men and women who were a little further along the journey, so that just important things like that I could know. In medical school, I was one of two Black men in my medical school class of 165. We had a total of about 10 underrepresented minorities, and establishing peer relationships that were also important in terms of your emotional and academic support. And we often would get together on Sundays, and we would make traditional dinners, and we would gather as a group and take turns at cooking for the rest of the group. And it also allowed you to not just have emotional support, but we were able to learn from some of our upper class members on things that would be important to know in advance, how to study, what professors like this, when to do research, when to start looking for summer jobs and things like that, that it's just hard to gather that information on your own. And so I would encourage that, you establish peer mentor relationships as well as other mentor relationships that have been discussed. And then one of the things that you'll notice from some of the statistics that Dr. Bowe showed, at every step, you're going to be one of few. And learning to get comfortable with that, and learning to make sure that the lens by which you see the world, you're able to articulate that. And strategies for even responding to bias. And I can tell you, even as I navigated from medical school to residency, where you saw a little bit of a fuller head gentleman in the picture that Dr. Brown showed. But we began to have conversations with ourselves and be able to have voice to what you were feeling, and then to be able to really kind of articulate it in ways that were important. And so I'll close with a couple examples. I remember when I was at the University of Michigan, it was at a time when a lot of affirmative action kind of cases were hitting the judicial system. And it even happened in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. And I remember kind of the energy and the feeling, and it can kind of make you feel even sort of more in the spotlight as to whether or not you belong somewhere. And I reached out to a mentor, Dr. Counter, who I mentioned early from my undergraduate days. And he came and he spoke to an audience of the University of Michigan Medical Center, first as a scientist, but then gave just hard details and statistics and educated that audience on the importance of underrepresented representation at their medical school and beyond. And I just remember with pride looking around the audience, seeing a man who looked like me speak to an audience that was quiet and you could hear a pin drop. So that was one example of how not only a mentor can come back, and Dr. Wampa said, keep in touch with these individuals because they will have value to you throughout your career. And certainly Dr. Counter did that for me. And then I also learned how to respond to biases. You know, there will be encounters, unfortunately, that you have that may generate really strong feelings. I can tell you, I was in academic medicine for almost 15 years, and I was having a polite conversation with a colleague when someone who came in kind of 3/4 way through the conversation, you know, took his privilege and began to talk to me, literally pointing his hand at me while he was speaking to me in such a condescending way that if we were not in the halls of academic medicine and you might have seen this in a grocery store or a parking lot, you might predict that this gentleman, you know, might have a significant conflict. And he certainly was escalating the situation. And I just remember, you know, some of my mentors on the need to have a reserve of professionalism that you can draw upon in moments like these, where maybe many of your peers won't even have to really draw upon that. And so audacious was this gentleman who closed the gap with me, pointing in my face. And I just had to stop him in his tracks and ask him what he was doing. And did he realize he was pointing his finger at me? And I needed to walk away, but this gentleman went ahead, lodged a complaint against me, and took it to the top of the organization. And he had developed the skill of being a bully, and people would just kind of bow out of his way because he would write you up. And you sometimes need to speak to yourself. And I told them that, and this was during the Obama administration, I said, I'd be delighted to take audience with anyone who will listen. I'll tell you exactly what happened. And he asked me to apologize to him. I said, if there's going to be an apology, he's going to give one to me. And I'm happy to have this conversation, you know, even go to Barack himself, because this was actually at the VA. And my point is that fair and unfair, you will need to call upon professionalism that sometimes your peers don't. But when you do, you need to also advocate and speak for what you know to be right, because there will be times and moments when you will be the educator, and your lens into a situation will be able to provide the insight and the clarity to elevate a situation, an organization, and some of your peers. And so with that, I'll just conclude and thanking for the opportunity to speak. I think the last thing I'll say is that I at no point had a path from the time that I entered medical school to the time that I become the chairman of the department of an academic medical center where I knew my journey. And I think it's important for you to take reflection and also to continue to be in touch with your mentors, because it was mentors who helped gave me the opportunity or sponsored me that I even dreamed or envisioned that I would be a chairman of a department, being able to set the vision and helping others who were earlier in their journey, whether they be medical students or residents or other faculty members, to accomplish their dreams in otolaryngology. So with that, I want to say thank you and encourage you to keep in touch with your mentors, follow your passions, be reflective and introspective on a regular basis to evaluate where your journey might go, because it isn't from point A to point B very often. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for sharing your experiences and for that advice. So we have about 10 minutes, and there are a few questions that I would like to discuss with the panelists. A couple are on the screen, but I do want to hit a couple of the questions that were asked prior to our meeting today. So the first question is for Dr. Bowe. It's with the newly merged residencies for MDs and DOs, how does the board do DO applications? I know that this will change from program director to program director, but as a DO applying broadly into ENT this fall, I'm a bit nervous that my ENT involvement and research will be overlooked simply because of my title.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Certainly I had this slide up there that was the input from the National Residency Matching Program in relation to the varieties of applicant types. I think that similar to one of the other slides that I put, there are probably programs that have a better track record and have more support for DO applicants. That may be a little bit hard to identify, but I think some of it is also just a lot of the outreach that everyone has been talking about. In terms of the Head Mirror website, as I mentioned, they're actually working on a DO dedicated page for the med student section. And then that broader interest group is also founded between MDs and DOs with a faculty, resident, and medical students, all from DOs. So I think that there are, a lot of resources coming out. As I mentioned, there's going to be that DO panel, but some of it, I think, kind of similar to what, everyone has mentioned. Reach out, send an email. If you don't get it back, it may be because that person has 1,400 emails and it fell to the bottom. I absolutely have colleagues that say, if I don't respond to you in 24 hours, it's lost. Try again. So don't be discouraged. I send emails to other people that I'm interested in their research, just being like, hey, I really liked your article. Sometimes they don't write back. It's fine. So don't be discouraged. Put yourself out there. You have come so far and gotten to the point that you have. And so even if you don't get that immediate response, there's a lot of people out there looking to support and give back. And so you'll find somebody.
And I think that advice could be used for our IMG colleagues and also those students that are a part of programs that don't have a home, otolaryngology residency. So that's great advice, Dr. Bowe. There was another question that was asked previously, and Dr. Brown, you did hit a little bit on that regarding the time in between the M3 and M4 year and research. I just wanted to see if you had any other advice to add for that research year. And this student is asking how his or her time could be spent, their time could be spent more wisely, and what looks impressive.
Yeah, so during the research year, it's important that you're productive and produce hopefully papers, hopefully first author papers. It's important that you know about the research because you're going to be asked about it. And so to be able to really understand it. So don't be passive, be very active in the process. Get to know your research mentor because it will be an expectation by many reviewing your application that you get a letter of recommendation from them. If you don't, if you spent like a year, doing research with someone and you don't get a letter from them, they're going to think, why is that? So again, cultivate that relationship with them. Let them know what your desires are. If you want to do, I think it's important as you write your papers up that you also present them nationally. We have a lot of medical students presenting at national meetings, and they do amazing jobs, and that gives them a lot of incredible exposure, and people do remember you from these opportunities. In addition, like I said earlier, continue to network and be a part of the clinical department if you have one. So we always recommend that our medical students who are doing a year of research with us go to grand rounds, go to morbidity and mortality, show that you're interested, show your face, because all of these very subtle things impact people. Say, oh, I remember you. I saw you all the time. You were in the front row. So there's so many nuanced things to being successful that have nothing to do with grades or scores. So make sure that you are present.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think when I remember interviewing some applicants and I've asked them about their research, and sometimes they don't have an answer, and it's really surprising, right? Because they have spent some time doing this. So that's great advice. I want to direct this question to Dr. Wungpao. So why the research track as opposed to a traditional track?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as you're applying for residency, you kind of have to look at, again, kind of do some introspection. For me, I had gone to the medical school I had gone to, there really wasn't a strong research presence. I think it's changing now from what I've heard. And so I knew that that was one of the weaknesses I had coming in to residency. So actually all of my top programs I ranked had a research track because I knew ultimately it's something that I need to engage in to become a full, well-rounded otolaryngologist. And that was my perspective on it. And so as far as the type of research that you do, it can kind of vary, basic versus clinical. So you have to also think about that, what you're really interested in. And then as you're applying and interviewing at places, you can't be afraid to ask, direct questions about what kind of work institutions do and what they're known for, what they churn out as far as productivity, and see if that aligns with your interests. So for me, it was more about becoming a well-rounded academic otolaryngologist. And I knew that in order to do that, I needed to spend some extra time doing research, whether it was 1 or 2 years.
Awesome. Thank you for that response. So I want to open this question to any of the panelists. How can our students earn strong letter of recommendations during an away rotation when attendance on service may change often?
I guess I can start just really briefly. So there was a rotation that I did and it actually took quite a few students. I think it was like 11 at the time. So if you can imagine, you're fighting for time and there's a bunch of you, and yeah, you're on one service for 1 week and that's kind of your shot. And it's very challenging. Fortunately, I was the only African-American and I was the only female. And so the other 10 were obviously white males. So that was like one thing that worked out for me, is that I stood out already without trying. But then it's kind of like I mentioned, the being present, being early, having supplies. I remember the first day I showed up, I had supplies with me and it was like a shocking phenomenon. And so then the next day, all the other students had that too. And when you ingratiate yourself with the residents, they can then kind of give you pointers on who to get letters from, right? Because they kind of identify who's willing to write letters for medical students and who's probably too busy and other things like that. And so at that point, you can kind of hone in on a particular attending. And when you're on for that week, you can kind of let your residents know, hey, I really would like to work with this person the majority of the week if possible. And so that's kind of what I did in this particular situation. So I was in their clinic all the time. I was in their OR. If I got assigned another OR case that was in the morning and then they had a clinic in the afternoon, I would work with that other attending in the morning in the OR and then go to their clinic in the afternoon. And so you kind of just try to maximize your week with them. And then the most important thing is to arrange a meeting with them one-on-one. Because yeah, they can see you kind of in the clinical realm, but for them to actually know you and write a letter that's your background, I made it a point, kind of like Dr. Brown mentioned, getting in touch with their assistant, making a meeting so we can sit one-on-one. And then I literally just told them who I was. And they literally wrote notes because at that time I'd worked with them enough that they kind of liked me and they thought they could write the letter. And so they just kind of jotted down who I was. I handed them my CV, and that was kind of my strategy for that problem.
Erin, if I could make a comment too, and then unfortunately I do have to run, but that's a very great suggestion too. I've taken the habit when I know a student is doing an away rotation, I meet with them, I make sure that there's some fundamentals that they are prepared for when they go on the rotation. And then I will send an email to a colleague at the place that they're going, giving them an introduction. And I tend to try to make that email to someone who, a chair or a faculty member at your institution. They'll kind of get a sense over time who writes good letters. Are their letters sort of personal, or they're just kind of terse and don't say much? It's not always best to get the chair or the most famous person in the department to get a letter. You want a strong letter. And so don't be afraid to go to someone on your who's on the faculty, one of your attendings, and be able to ask that question even before you go away to the away rotation, and even get perhaps an email introduction, so that they kind of, your name is familiar with them when they meet you when you're on service.
Yeah, and can I just add something? What Dr. Wangpa and Dr. Taylor said is spot on. And what I take away from Dr. Wangpa's message is you have to be intentional. If you're intentional, you'll be successful. Rarely is success by accident. So don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ingratiate the residents and ingratiate the faculty and show what you're worth. I always tell my medical students when they're on a rotation, it's not what you know, it's what everyone else knows you know. That's how you get evaluated. You can know everything, can be all in your brain, but if no one else knows that, they won't be able to evaluate it. So figure out how to shine with humility.
Awesome advice. We have a couple more questions. I do know that we are over the hour, but there are a couple questions that I would like the panelists to address. So how, or with securing away rotations, and it seems to be pretty competitive this year just because of the limited time, would you all recommend reaching out to program directors directly to schedule away outside of the VSAS, or go through the appropriate measures?
Yeah, I think one of the things that certainly even us on the flip side of this equation is there have been a lot of changes to the residency selection process over the past couple of years, and certainly with COVID. And so I think in many ways some of us are also figuring this out to some extent. I think similar to what we've kind of pointed out here, there may be other avenues too to reach out to a particular institution through like the diversity liaison list or somebody else that you can start just some of that initial inquiry instead of maybe going directly to the program director. And that may be an avenue to open up even like a research project or something that gets in the door a little bit, and then that may make it more easy to approach some of that kind of competitive question or identify the fact that program is of particular interest to you. Yeah. And so I think that might be a kind of a good initial approach is just kind of feeling out potentially through that other avenue. And I think Dr. Brown might kind of chime in too.
I think that's a great suggestion. And additionally, use your home mentors. If there's a program that you're really interested in, they're not going to call like 5 or 10, but if there's like 1 or 2, then they will do that. The other thing to consider, and it may be too late for some with this, is that when you write your specific paragraph about the institution, really think about it, because we can tell when people just cut and paste and just change the name of the institution. So when you're thinking about the match, VSAS, it's like you're dating someone. It's like for their eyes only. And so you don't want to make it seem like you got people on the side. So like you're cutting and pasting. So it's like in Destiny's Child, say my name.
Yeah, I want to echo what both Dr. Brown and Dr. Bowe are saying. I think that you need to be personal when you are approaching, if and when you are approaching program directors and or other mentors. I also think that, times are a little different now, and with how things are a little bit more competitive in terms of getting these away rotations, as Dr. Brown mentioned, using your mentors as an avenue, and picking one or two places that you're really interested in. I think that's some key advice right there. And hey, you still might not get that away rotation, and that's okay. You find a place, and we're supposed to be where we're supposed to be, and it'll work out for sure. Do any of y'all have any closing remarks before I close our panel today?
Well, one, I want to say thank you, Dr. Fawcett, for your leadership in this. Two, there is a question that I wanted to address because it's in there about gaining a mentor. How do you approach one from outside your institution? What my suggestion is, do some word of mouth. I don't know if you can look online for who's a great mentor, but ask people who went before you. This is so important. As you should have mentors who are a year or two ahead of you in the process. Ask them, did they have mentors? There are a lot of different medical student networks. You might be able to find some residency medical student interactions through the Head Mirror. People who are African-American are part of the Black Oto Network, or Women in Otolaryngology. Ask them, who are great mentors for me? This is my situation. Who can help me out with this? So I think word of mouth and seeking out from other people might yield better results than looking online for specific things about a potential mentor.
Yeah, and to add to that, I found my mentor at Academy. I was a resident at a small program, and she's now my sponsor, and that's a whole another thing when you feel that sponsorship. But I walked up to her and I said, hey, I've seen your research, and I have common goals, I think, and I don't have somebody that has these interests, the same interests that I do, so help me. And I will do, what you say, really. And she has been monumental in my career thus far. And as I mentioned, went from mentorship to sponsorship. And I think that, she always says, you're the one that approached me and asked me for guidance. And so, I don't think anyone's going to look at you crazy if you, approach one of us. And if our bandwidth is spread too thin, we can direct you to somebody else that might be able to help you. All right, well, I really want to thank all of you, all of our panelists, number one. I mean, we've spent some evenings together, and I appreciate your time, your guidance, your leadership. Also, we want to thank our students. You guys are the future, and we want to continue to guide you to be successful in your career, however you want it to look. And so please do not be shy to reach out to us, and thank you.